So, hello everyone. This is Neslihan from COCUS, which is a community where students and professionals from various fields of study get around to make resources based on cognitive sciences more accessible and provide students a way of communication with the various events we hold throughout the year, such as academic cognition, which is a series of talks preferably given by undergrads and grad students who are relatively less recognized, and book cognition that provides an opportunity for professors and students to exchange ideas revolved around a book of choice for several weeks, and growing up in science, where professors share their lifelong experiences about the academic life. You can follow our accounts on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and you can also support us from the patreon.com, and we would truly appreciate your support. Today's event, named the Cognitive Webinar, is designed to be online and held entirely in English, aiming for an international audience. We would like to provide a platform, not just for science communication, but also interaction of academics from all over the world. Today, we're going to listen to Dr. Grace Lindsay, who is a computational neuroscientist and the author of Models of the Mind: How Physics, Engineering, and Mathematics Have Shaped Our Understanding of the Brain. She got her PhD at the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience at Columbia University in the lab of Ken Miller. She is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit of the University College London. She is currently working on building functional and interpretable models of sensory processing. Today, we're going to listen to her talk entitled Modeling Visual Attention in Neuroscience, Psychology, and Machine Learning. Her talk will last about 40 to 50 minutes, and then we will give a 5-minute break. After the short break, we will proceed with the Q&A session, which will also last about 30 minutes. Before we proceed, I would like to emphasize the fact that we would like our attendees to ask their questions with their microphones and video cameras open if possible, but it's not a requirement. You can also ask your questions through the Zoom chat as well. So, Dr. Lindsay, take us away whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about modeling attention kind of across domains in psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning. And it's important always when talking about attention to give some sort of definition, because as we'll see through the examples that I give, attention, the word attention is used to mean many, many different things, even within each of these fields. And then certainly when you're trying to compare across these different fields, it can get very confusing what counts as attention or what attention is supposed to mean. So I've kind of came up with this definition that I think fits a lot of the cases that I'm interested in, which is to say that attention is the ability to flexibly control limited computational resources. So I'll try to highlight in each of the examples of attention that I give, like the way in which it fits this definition. But other people have very different definitions. I mean, there's usually something in this ballpark. Something has to be limited, and there has to be, attention has to be flexible to some extent. But yeah, so this is a pretty broad definition that I settled on in order to be able to capture many of the ways that the word attention is used, though still not all of them. So a lot of this talk is going to be based on a review article that I wrote that is about comparing attention across these different fields. And the first part of that review tries to lay out the type of research that people do on attention in neuroscience and psychology, so brain-based definitions of attention. And then the second section of that covers attention in machine learning, while highlighting where there are similarities to biological attention, but also attention just has its own definition and line of work in machine learning. And then the third section of that is kind of ideas for future interaction between these different fields. That review covers things somewhat broad uses of attention. I'm going to focus in this talk on visual attention in particular. And part of that is because that's where my research is focused. Research that I've done in the past has been on visual attention. And I'm going to include in this talk a section on some of my own work that kind of demonstrates the benefits of being able to think about attention across different fields. So that's part of the reason that I'm focusing on visual attention in this talk, but also it just happens to be the place where kind of the overlap between the biological concepts of attention and the machine learning concepts of attention are strongest. So I'm going to get into kind of these relationships here so that it's clear how attention in biology relates to how attention is implemented in machine learning. So to start, I want to talk about kind of one of the earlier forms of attention that was measured experimentally, and that is saccades. So saccades are small eye movements that we all make several times per second. Frequently, you don't even notice that you're making them. But pretty early on in the history of experimental psychology, people were interested in measuring these eye movements to kind of track where people were looking if you showed them something of interest. And so this example that I'm showing here, people were trying, the scientists were trying to see how people move their eyes when they're reading. So they put, text in front of someone, and then they wanted to see how they're moving their eyes. Now we have methods involving cameras and other things where you can track eye movements, but at the time, I think this is from the 1920s, they put like this metal contact lens on the person's eye and connected it to a rod that was then connected to a pen that would move on a paper. And so when the person moved their eyes, their eyeball would move this rod and it would move the pen. But that seems just so incredibly uncomfortable that you would imagine that perhaps the eye movements they're recording aren't entirely natural. But still, these kind of early experiments allowed people to track eye movements and kind of create hypotheses about why people look where they look and observe just patterns in saccades and really kind of identify what saccades were. So one of the things that people noticed is that the pattern of saccades that people make, if you show them, so in this example, subjects are shown this painting, and you can ask them kind of in advance to have different responses to the painting. So you can not tell them anything, just show them the painting and see what they do. Some other examples you can see in the caption here, or you can ask them to estimate how wealthy the family in the painting is, give the ages of the people in the painting, summarize what the family was doing before these visitors arrived. And they're showing here the different patterns of saccades that you get when you ask people to do these different tasks. So given a fixed stimulus, the painting is the same in all cases. People's eye movements are different depending on what they're trying to do. And so the pattern of saccades is sometimes referred to as overt spatial attention. So it's spatial because it's where in space you're looking. It's attention because you can only foveate at one location at a time. The fovea is where we have most photoreceptors. So the fovea is a limited computational resource. We only have, so many photoreceptors. The place where they're densest is where we can sample the most information. And so that limited resource can be flexibly controlled depending on what task we're doing. So that's kind of why saccades are considered a very basic form of attention, is because you're just very explicitly controlling essentially the input to your visual system by choosing where to look. And overt, we'll see, is in opposition to covert spatial attention, which I'll get into. So that's one of the types of attention that are commonly studied in neuroscience and psychology. I want to get into how this concept can map onto ideas in machine learning, but first I have to kind of explain the basics of how people think about vision in machine learning. And so the common neural network architecture, so people use artificial neural networks to process, well, a lot of things in machine learning, but certainly for visual processing. And the type of artificial neural network that people use to study the visual system is called convolutional neural networks. And broadly, the operations that these networks perform were inspired by operations that the mammalian visual system performs. And that's kind of correspondence is shown here. So in convolutional neural networks, you have convolutional layers, and these are layers that apply filters to the layer below. If it's the first layer in the network, they apply a filter to the image. And so that means that they're kind of looking for a specific pattern in the image. and the activity of the units in this convolutional layer will be high if the image pattern matches the pattern that that convolutional filter is looking for. And so you just basically get a map of kind of where that feature exists in the image. So in this case, we can imagine a convolutional filter that's looking for oriented edges. And you'll get a map of activity that represents where those edges are. And then these convolutional layers are usually followed by pooling layers, which look at the activity of a subset of the units in the convolutional layer and just take the maximum value of that set of units. So what this provides is some spatial invariance, because the convolutional layer would tell you, oh, this oriented edge is kind of at this exact location. And the pooling layer would say, well, I don't care if it's at that exact location. If it's anywhere within this area, I'm going to say it's present. Those are kind of the two basic operations that these networks do, and they mimic the computations that simple and complex cells were found to do in the cat visual cortex back in the 50s and 60s. And so simple cells look for oriented edges in image, and they respond if there's an oriented edge in their spatial receptive field. And then complex cells get input from multiple simple cells and will respond if that oriented edge is present in any of the receptive fields of the simple cells. So that's how you get this kind of correspondence between the cells or the layers that are looking for patterns, and then the cells and layers that are allowing for some spatial invariance in those patterns. So if you stack these convolution and pooling layers after each other, you can create a deep convolutional neural network that in its full structure kind of mimics the ventral visual stream. So as you go through this network, you get cells that respond to more and more complex features, because you're kind of initially looking for simple patterns in the image, but then at the next layer of convolution, you're looking for patterns in patterns of the image. And so you build up in complexity in terms of what kind of features you're looking for in image space. And then also you get larger and larger receptive fields as you do these pooling layers. An individual neuron in the later layers of a deep neural network will respond to an object in a very large space in the original image. And that all of those properties are the same in the ventral visual stream as well. So that's kind of the correspondence between these artificial neural networks and the ventral visual stream. So that lays the groundwork for then using these convolutional neural networks as a way to study visual attention. And going back to this concept of overt visual attention, which happens in humans and animals via saccades. This is a paper from, I think it's 2015, that offers a way to kind of add that type of attention to a convolutional neural network. And so basically, the idea here is that you are given an image, and the goal of the network is to kind of categorize that image. So in this case, this could be considered an example of afternoon tea. This is a table setting for tea. And like in the biological case, the network starts off being only given a small part of the image. So it can only look at one location in the image at a time. And so this network, that portion of the image is passed into the visual encoder, which is a convolutional neural network. And if it's able to kind of classify the image based on that small patch, it can do it. Alternatively, it can kind of look at this patch of the image and say, I don't know what's going on yet, I need to look somewhere else. And there's a part of the artificial network called the attention selection network that would then output a new location in image space that the network would essentially saccade to. And then on the next round, it gets input from that location of the image, and the process repeats. So this is basically a neural network that through training learns to sample different locations in image space so that it can efficiently classify the image that it's given. And the benefits here from a machine learning perspective are basically that if you had a really large image, to have a network that just processes that whole image at a time in parallel is computationally costly. If it's the case that the network doesn't actually need to see the whole image, but can just make, 2 or 3 saccades around the image and do that instead, then you have a computational benefit of using attention. And so machine learning, this type of attention where you just basically crop the image and only give the network a portion of the image at a time is called hard visual attention, because you're just ignoring the whole rest of the picture. You're just cropping out part of it and passing it into the artificial neural network. Okay, so I said I would talk about covert spatial attention as well in comparison to overt spatial attention. So covert spatial attention happens when our eyes are actually fixed. So no eye movements are allowed in studies of covert spatial attention. So any effects of this type of attention are not because you're moving your eyes around and taking in different parts of the visual scene. The eyes remain fixed. And these experiments are done with a cueing. You show a subject, basically a fixation cross is telling them where to keep their eyes for the entirety of this trial. And then you somehow cue them as to which spatial location is going to be most relevant for the task that they're doing. So in this case, people are simply cued to the location, one of 2 locations, indicating where they should expect the target that they're looking for to show up. And so they can be cued validly, meaning that they're told, in this case, to look on the right, and in fact, the target will show up on the right. And then their job is to respond when the target shows up. Or they can be cued invalidly, meaning they're told that basically to put their attention on the left side, and in fact, the target shows up on the right side. And so what these kinds of studies show is that when you validly cue people where something is going to occur, they can respond to it faster and more accurately than when they're invalidly cued. And again, as I said, the location of the eyes is not changing. So this isn't an effect of simply looking at the location that they were cued to. It's a more subtle effect that's happening completely internally, because everything about the external environment and what's kind of hitting the retina is constant, whether you're validly or invalidly cued. And so because this effect, has to be occurring through internal changes, people have recorded neural activity from many different visual brain areas during these kinds of tasks to understand what exactly those internal changes are that lead to better performance. And so this is showing an example where in red, you're seeing trials where the attention was cued towards the receptive field of the neuron that was being recorded. So the area and space where that neuron normally responds to things, attention was deployed to that location, compared to in blue when attention was deployed to a different location. And you can see that across many different visual areas, this is V1 is primary visual cortex, V2 and V4, there's a significant change in neural activity for cases where attention is deployed to a neuron's spatial receptive field. And you can actually see also that this effect is stronger in later visual areas such as V4 than it is for V1. And also there's some latency results that show that this difference shows up in V4 before it shows up in V1. So there's kind of this idea that some other area of the brain is targeting these visual brain areas and saying, turn up the volume on the neurons that correspond to this spatial location because we're expecting something to happen there. So the equivalent concept in machine learning is called soft spatial attention. And the way that this works is similar to the hard spatial attention that corresponds to overt attention. But rather than cropping the image and only allowing the network to see that cropped version of the image, in this case, you simply weight different parts of the image more or less. So again, you kind of put in an image to a network. The network decides then how to deploy its attention back on the image. And so I'm showing here an example where this is a network that's trying to categorize action. So in this case, there's someone doing a golf swing, and the weighting that they're putting on different locations is kind of indicating where the network is attending to. So you can see a large kind of white bulb here that corresponds to the end of the golf club. And so that's saying this is not a case where the image is cropped just to be the end of the golf club, but the activity, the actual values that enter into the neural network get scaled up at that location to kind of amplify the signal of that location in comparison to other locations. This is another network that works somewhat similarly, except it is explicitly for generating captions rather than categorizing images. So this is a scenario where you can imagine that attention is even more important to some extent because, you know, as you're describing a scene, you may want to focus on different parts of the image that you're describing. So example here is the caption that the network produces is a bird flying over a body of water. Well, when you're producing the word bird, you might look at the bird, and that's what they're showing here in these maps of where attention was placed during this generation. But then when you want to describe what the bird is doing, you're looking in the background, and that's where attention is placed when the word water is being produced. So that really highlights the importance of attention as a flexible resource. In one moment, I want to deploy my attention to the bird. In the very next moment, as I'm producing a different word, I want to deploy my attention to something else. So I've been talking about spatial attention, which is kind of conceptually easy to understand, that there are locations in space and you kind of want to pay more attention to what's happening in those locations. But we also have covert feature-based attention. And for that, in the kind of studies that look at that, you don't cue the subject where something will happen, but you can give them some sort of cue about kind of what will happen or what they should care about. In this case, this is a study where people can either hear a word or they hear a meaningless white noise stimulus, and then they're shown kind of a challenging image. So in this example, they could hear the word pumpkin and then be shown a drawing of a pumpkin, but it has a bunch of squiggly lines over it, so it's hard to see. And then you ask them, did you see something? Was it a pumpkin? And just like in the spatial example, where when you validly cue them about where something is going to happen, they're better at detecting it. When you validly cue people in this paradigm, they're better at detecting the object. And so this can't be due to paying more attention to any specific location in space, because they don't know anything about where it's going to be in space, and that's not really what's relevant here. They're somehow deploying their attention to like the concept of pumpkin, basically, in this case. And so that's what feature-based attention is that it's not knowing anything about spatial location isn't going to help you. You need to know what visual features are going to be relevant. But similarly to spatial attention, people have found a lot of neural correlates of feature attention that kind of follow the same principles. Basically, the neurons that normally respond strongly to a visual feature respond even more strongly when attention is deployed to that feature. So, you know, if you're thinking about something like pumpkin, then maybe the neurons that normally respond strongly to orange objects, their activity goes up when attention is deployed to pumpkin. The way in which attention activity changes, the way in which attention causes activity to change is multiplicative. So like the activity scaled up by some factor. And again, as I said with spatial attention, these effects here. So a lot of parallels between covert spatial attention and covert feature-based attention. So this is where I'm going to talk briefly about work that I did about feature-based attention and really showing how using these models from machine learning can help us understand biological attention, kind of how the brain increases performance via biological attention. So in this study, I used a convolutional neural network, just as I've been discussing, because of their similarity to the visual stream. And normally these networks are trained to classify images of objects into one of 1,000 different object categories. But for the purposes of what I wanted to do, I wanted to kind of replicate the basically the pumpkin example of you can cue the network to attend to something, And then you ask if that queuing makes it better at detecting that, that object. And so for that, I needed the network to kind of just give me a yes or no output. You know, did you see a pumpkin? Yes or no. And so I simply replaced the last layer of this network with a series of binary classifiers that correspond to different object categories. So that's just to get the network to be able to do the same thing that human subjects do in these studies. And then I show the network some challenging images. In this case, I'm using images that are made up of multiple different individual image objects. And so in the left example, these are merged images that are 2 different images overlaid on top of each other. And in the right, they are an array of 4 different images. And so this just makes the network more challenging, because a pretty frequent finding in the attention literature broadly, not even just in visual attention, is that basically you need to be doing something challenging for attention to matter, for attention to kind of kick in. And to have an effect. So we need to challenge the network by showing it images that it would struggle to classify. And this is just proving that it does struggle to classify these, because if I just show a normal image of one object at a time, the network, these binary classifiers perform very well. But when I show them these merged and array images, it performs poorly. So the question is, can attention make the network better at classifying these images? And specifically what I'm interested in is, can a biologically inspired form of attention create these differences? Because in machine learning, usually what you do is you just kind of train the attention mechanism, as I've showed, to help performance, but the details of how it works are not tied to biology. They're not inspired by how neurons change their activity with attention. So here I wanted to actually use the inspiration from biology in how I deploy attention on these networks. And so as I showed before, feature-based attention, the way that it changes neural activity is neurons that prefer that feature, that respond strongly to that feature normally, their activity goes up. And neurons that don't like that feature, that don't normally respond strongly when that object type is shown, their activity goes down. And so that's the main effect that I replicate in the network. And to do that, though, I have to first figure out what the different neurons in the network prefer and don't prefer. And so for that, I just simply show the network a bunch of images of different object categories. And I just record the response of the neurons to different object categories. And from that, you can get basically a tuning curve that shows you which objects the different neurons in the network prefer or don't prefer. And then when it comes time to have the network attend to an object category, I just scale the activity of these neurons up or down based on if they prefer or don't prefer the object that's being attended. So in black would be the normal input-output function of one of these artificial neurons. And then you can imagine if I wanted to attend to this last category, let's say this is pumpkins, this neuron up here on the top has a high tuning value in response to that object category. So that means it likes pumpkins. And so I would scale its activity up by changing the input-output function like this. This neuron down here has a slight negative value, meaning it slightly disprefers pumpkins compared to other categories. And so I would scale its activity down. And so this is just, when I'm telling the network to attend to a category, I just go in and scale all the activity of the units up and down like this. And then I see if that makes the network better at detecting the category that's being attended. And so, yeah, so that's the question I wanted to ask. Can you connect the neural effects of attention to the performance enhancements that have been observed? And basically I can do this modulation of applying attention at any of the layers in the network. And what I see is that, in fact, you do get a performance increase in terms of the ability of the network to correctly classify if a given object is present in an image. When you add attention, it makes the network better at doing that. And specifically, it makes the network is most enhanced when you apply attention at later layers, which is kind of similar to the fact that we see attention has a stronger impact at later visual areas as well. So to summarize the brief recap of this study, I showed that applying attention in an artificial neural network using biological inspiration does lead to an enhancement in performance of that network in a way that replicates the performance enhancements that we see with attention experimentally. And then I didn't get into it, but I did a lot of analysis on the network to kind of understand how the attention works in the network and to provide reasons why applying attention at later layers in the network is actually the best way to get performance enhancements. But so this is just an example of where having this overlap between these machine learning models that can perform interesting and challenging tasks, but also kind of have enough biological inspiration to be used as models of the visual system, you can get kind of a really fruitful interaction where we can connect the neural changes with these performance changes. So going back to kind of summarizing different types of attention in machine learning that relate to biological attention, there are also papers that do feature-based covert feature attention in artificial neural networks, where again, the network is trained to not control what kind of information it gets from different spatial locations in the image, but rather control the activity of different feature maps in the image. So this is similar to what I showed in my study, but again, it's not inspired directly by the biology, rather the whole system is just trained and you kind of get what you get in the end, but it increases performance. So to summarize, soft spatial attention in machine learning corresponds to covert spatial attention in biology, and this is where different spatial locations are kind of differently weighted, even though the exact image that's coming in is the same. And covert feature attention means that you weigh different features differently, but it's not based on spatial location. So another big area of attention in machine learning is attention in language models. And so historically, one of kind of the best performing language models in terms of language translation were these recurrent sequence models, where you'd have a sentence that you'd want to translate into a different language. So in this case, it's the cat is on the mat. And that sentence would get encoded via a recurrent neural network into a series of vectors that represent different words in the sentence. And then that information would go into a network that generates a sentence as the output. So it would generate one word at a time. So you'd have the first sentence in the target language. So in this case, it's French. And then the way attention comes into play here is that now in the context of this first word that the network has output, that combines with the representation of the sentence to create this weighting of all the different words in the input sentence. So I'm showing here different widths of the arrow are different weights of connecting the input sentence to the network that creates the output sentence. And the idea here is that basically different languages have different ordering of words. And so you can't simply, go through and translate word for word and get a grammatically correct sentence, but you might want to, at one point in the input sentence, as the output sentence is generating words, you might need to look at, say, the last word in the input sentence in order to generate the second word in the output sentence, depending on the languages that you're translating. And so here the attention is this flexible weighting of the different input words to allow the network to focus on the right information at the right time as it's producing the output sentence. Another very common form and definition of attention in machine learning that has kind of surpassed these sequence-based models for language translation is the transformer network. And this is from a paper that was called Attention is All You Need. So this type of attention is pretty different from a lot of the types of attention, even in the machine learning literature that I've been showing you, which usually involve a recurrent model where information is taken in at one point in time, and then that information is used to decide where attention gets deployed at the next time step. That was kind of what I showed you in the spatial attention models and also in the language production models. In this case, it's one of the benefits is that you don't have the need for as much recurrence in this model, which makes it easier to train. But then what gets defined as attention has kind of shifted. So what happens here in these models is that you have inputs and they're all kind of encoded in parallel. And then you use these encodings to generate what are called value, key, and query representations. So that's this V, K, and Q here. Those things get multiplied. You can see here there's matrix multiplication between the key and the query, and then again with the values. So you basically take in all of your information at once, and then you do some multiplication between how that information is represented, and then that gives you a weighting that you apply to that same information. So it's a little bit different because it doesn't have this kind of feel of dynamically reweighting things as you're producing outputs, but instead just kind of the whole context is taken in, and that whole entire context is used to create weightings. And then this process repeats multiple times in the network. So this has become kind of the more standard definition of attention in machine learning. It's frequently called self-attention, but it really loses a lot of the connections to biological concepts of attention. So from my perspective, this is, despite its popularity and its success in machine learning, isn't really a case of inspiration from biological attention in any super meaningful way. Okay, so I showed, basically I focused on, as I said, the visual aspects of this overlap between biological and artificial attention. So I talked about where these connections are strongest, and also there are a bunch of other areas where there are kind of weaker connections, but still of some interest. And so I wanted to get into just kind of ideas for further inspiration that can happen between biological attention and artificial models. And this will just be kind of a broad, high-level list of ways where they could influence each other. So I think a natural, thing people care about in machine learning is how do you enhance performance? And we know that attention enhances performance. When people pay attention to things, they perform better. So to take inspiration from biology, I think there's a few different aspects of how attention is applied or deployed in the brain that could be relevant to artificial neural networks. And so the first one is kind of where attention is found. As I said, there are different parts of the visual system show different strengths of the impacts of attention on neural activity. And so that's something that people building artificial neural networks could take into account and have the attention that they build in kind of target different parts of the network differently. There's also the question of what exactly attention should do to neural activity. And I referenced that kind of the default, both for the effect that is found in biology and how it's deployed in artificial neural networks, is some sort of reweighting or multiplicative scaling of activity. So to just say that attention scales activity up or down. And that's true, that is a big part of how activity is changed in real brains by attention, but there's also a lot of other effects of attention that have been observed experimentally. So attention changes noise properties of neurons. It usually makes them less noisy. There are findings related to kind of how attention synchronizes or desynchronizes neural activity. And so there's just a lot of depth to how real neural activity changes with attention, most of which doesn't get translated into artificial neural networks. And then there's also coordinated effects of attention, by which I mean attention can do different things in different brain areas. So in the sensory system itself, we see a lot of kind of scaling of neural activity, as I've discussed, but in kind of what are considered more downstream readout areas, some of those effects are different. And if you kind of get rid of the effects in the different areas, you have different impacts on task performance. So we kind of know that attention is targeting multiple different brain areas at once, and it's changing them all differently. And so it could be interesting to basically have multiple different attention mechanisms within a single network and allow them to do different things to enhance performance overall. There's also the question of how to deploy attention. So in a lot of the lab studies, as I showed, you kind of tell the subject where to put their attention. You either cue them with a spatial location or you cue them with an object or a visual feature that they should attend to. But in real life, we need to decide constantly where we're putting our attention and what we're attending to. And that's really where a lot of the intelligence comes in and is in making those choices. So how can we get artificial neural networks to be good at making those kinds of choices? And one is to train directly from biological data. So there are some examples where artificial systems were trained to make saccades based on the saccade patterns of real humans. And so that can teach the network, this is what humans care about. This is how a human would parse this scene and what they would pay attention to in this visual scene. And so that should hint to the network that these are the important parts of the scene, and that can be helpful in training. It's also clear that we have a bias towards things like novelty, and there's other kind of higher level forms of curiosity that will guide our attention. And there could be a lot of beneficial reasons for having that bias. And so incorporating that into artificial neural networks could also help them learn more effectively about their environment. And then also there can be conflicts between different motivations for attention. So bottom of attention, if there's something like flashes and it catches your eye, but at the same time, you're trying to look elsewhere to accomplish a task, you have this conflict between your bottom up attention and kind of top down attention of what you're trying to do. And in the brain, that tends to get resolved just at the local circuit that's getting input from both of these areas. And so we have to think about, in an artificial system, if there were conflicts of attention being pulled in different directions, how does that conflict get resolved? And then there's a big there's a lot to discuss about the relationship between attention and learning, basically. And so attention basically provides some built-in priors for learning. There are things that when we're born, it's kind of known that infants orient towards face-like patterns of light. And so that orienting makes it easier for them to then learn about faces, because they at least know to look at faces, and then they faces. So built-in attentional priors seem very important for having an organism learn about the relevant things in their environment. And that's something we can incorporate into artificial systems. There's also social learning of attention, where this is showing an example where you're tracking where children are looking and where their parents are looking, and the extent to which they're kind of both looking at the same thing together. And so it's clear that when people are making these saccades and these overt eye movements, that's a signal to other people around them about what they're attending to and what is relevant to them. And that's a pretty strong signal that we use to guide our own attention. And that's something that could be useful to incorporate into artificial systems. And then attention is kind of intimately tied to learning, because usually you need to attend to something to learn about it. And so there's this loop of kind of you're attending to something and then you learn about it, but that's going to also change your attentional system and maybe make you attend to it more. And so there's this important, we need to understand that connection better in a way that would help train artificial systems as well. And there's also the case that we use attention, which is this kind of limited conscious resource, but ultimately to train unconscious systems. It's common that when you're learning a new motor skill in particular, you have to really pay attention to what you're doing. You have to track where your hand is and what you're trying to do, if you're like learning to play guitar or something like that. But then eventually this becomes unconscious. So you put in attention to be able to not have to attend to something later, essentially. And we don't really have any kind of separation like that so much in the artificial systems that people use. And then there are a few things about attention that are sometimes described as kind of limitations of attention, but I think it would be important to determine if they really are bugs or if they're actually features that make attention even more useful. And so one thing that comes up is that you can have cross-modal interactions that you would think are are not helpful. And by this, I mean across sensory modalities. So like we know that if you tell people to attend to a location in visual space, their auditory attention will also be kind of dragged towards that space, even if that's not relevant for what they're doing at that time. You kind of can't dissociate these two sensory modalities. Or there are things like priming, where you show someone a word and then they're going to be distracted by something that relates to that word, even if that's not relevant for what they're doing at the time. And so these seem like bugs, but there's a lot of good reason that you should tie your visual and auditory attention together, because usually things occur in a place in space and they make sound from that space as well as looking like they're from that space. And so it's not clear that these actually are bugs, but rather like good simplified priors to have about the world. And then distractibility is something that of course comes up a lot in attention, and kind of people thinking that being distracted is bad, and you know, you want to reduce the amount to which you get distracted by things that aren't what you're focusing on. But then of course in the extreme, if you were focusing on, you know, doing your work at your computer and there was a fire alarm going off, you would want to be distracted by that. So it's clear that distractibility has its role. And what is interesting is figuring out the exact right level of distractibility, and kind of, you know, that's, as I've said before, that's kind of where the intelligence comes in, is what should you be distracted by and what should you ignore. That's actually a fine balance that it could be hard to figure out for an artificial system. And then we also have the sleep-wake cycle, which I didn't get into here, but kind of general levels of arousal are also kind of understood or studied in a similar framework as attention. So, you know, when you're sleepy, you can't pay attention as well, you don't perform as well on tasks. When you're all perked up and caffeinated, you do. And so there's a question of kind of, why do we even have these periods of time where we can't take in sensory information at all? Like when you're completely asleep, you're attending to nothing essentially. And so that seems like, well, that's not great, because, you know, you might want to be able to be attending to things at that time, but it's clear that sleep has a role in terms of consolidating information and all that. And so it's possible that artificial systems would need something like that as well. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and thank you to my funders as well.
So thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Lindsay. We're gonna give a 5-minute break, and then we will be back for the Q&A session. All right, everyone, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand, and if you do not feel comfortable, you know, sharing your video, you can also type it in the chat, or as a third option, you can still ask your question with your video microphone open, and then we can basically remove it from the recording once we're, you know, gonna share it on YouTube. Martin, are you asking a question currently? Because I cannot hear you. Nope. Okay. Okay, in the meantime, if anyone else has a question, feel free to raise your hand.
I have a question.
Perfect. Please go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. The question is, why do I actually need attention in a neural network? Because for example, if we have a good filter that can select good enough feature, and then why do we have to need another layer of attention to make the feature visible?
Yeah, so I think there's a few reasons. One is kind of computational limitations. So if you had kind of an infinitely big network, you could have a feature that, features that are perfectly suited for anything you could possibly want to do, and then you probably wouldn't need attention. Assuming that you have some limitations such that you have a limited number of filters you can use and just a limited size of the artificial neural network, then there may be cases where you don't have the completely optimal set of filters for what you'll need to detect, but with a little bit of tinkering with attention, the system can still be good. It can learn to upsample from features when it's trying to find one thing and downsample from those same features when it's trying to do something else. So that's why I say attention is a flexible control of a limited resource. So you have to have a limitation somewhere. If your system isn't limited, then it's hard to argue why you need attention. But if it does have limitations, then you want to be able to flexibly decide which part of your system you're taking the most influence from at any time. So like in the spatial attention example for the networks, you can't, it's more expensive to process the entire image in parallel than it is to decide on specific crop locations that won't total up to the entire image. So you're just acknowledging that you have a limitation, and how can you most intelligently sample and focus on subcomponents of your input or of your own activity in light of that limitation.
Okay, so a follow-up question. It implies that if you have a small neural network and then attention is gonna have, but you have a extremely large neural network, maybe attention is not required. Is it true in the case of deep neural networks?
Well, it's not going to just be small versus large neural network. It always has to be relative to the scale of the problem the network is solving. So if you have a small neural network that is the only task it needs to do is like classify an image as being black or white, then it won't, even a small neural network won't need attention for that. If you have a large neural network that's trying to generate captions for any kind of natural image you would show at it, that even for a large neural network, that's going to be challenging. So it's always about the relationship between the capacity of the neural network and the complexity of the task that the neural network is trying to do. And usually those things just get tied, where people are doing studies where they use a larger neural network because they're trying to do a harder task. And so you can't say, oh, when they used a larger neural network, it didn't need attention because they tried a harder task when they used a larger neural network. So I don't think anyone's actually explicitly picked like a single task and varied the size of the attention of the network and tried each size with or without an attention mechanism. That's kind of what you would need to do to get at that. But I don't think anyone's done that.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else? Mark-John, were you able to figure out your microphone issue?
I don't think so.
Oh, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, great.
Awesome.
Yeah, sorry for that delay. I don't know what was wrong. So my question was about priming specifically. You touched a little bit on that, how neural networks might benefit from those studies in which irrelevant information becomes relevant in a way. An important feature that seems to be present in those studies also is the temporal resolution that they have for especially low-level stimuli. People could process them so fast by means of feed-forward signals that participants do not even have to be conscious of them, right? So my question is, how are the network models designed to mimic such temporal sensitivities in that we observe in human beings?
Yeah, so I think yeah, I didn't really get so deep into the like kind of different ways that these things could happen, but they could happen in what's more considered like a bottom-up way, where it's like feed forward, like you get an input in one sensory modality, but just the connections, the architecture across those modalities is such that that's going to necessarily start activating a different modality. And it's not even a matter of kind of, oh, some other like more frontal brain region recurrently decided to go activate that brain area. And yeah, so in that kind of system, you get even faster kind of timescale interference across modalities and stuff like that. I mean, you could make a neural network that has that if you have a neural network that has two different input modalities and they do just kind of converge at some point in a feed-forward way where they're sharing information, then you would expect that maybe you could get some kind of those kinds of priming effects that could happen very quickly. I mean, relating the details of timescales and behavioral experiments to artificial neural networks is difficult because you have to decide what kind of like a time step counts as in your network and, you know, all of that. So these kinds of neural networks are not well suited for like super fine grained comparisons on like millisecond timescales. There's kind of just a more relative thing, like, can this happen quickly or slowly? Like, does it happen in the feed forward pass or does it require recurrent passes? But yeah, you could certainly imagine kind of mimicking the way some regions of the brain are thought to interact. You just have connections between two different sensory modality pathways that just allow for that immediate influence. And now all of a sudden, the priming from this modality is influencing the processing in this other one, and it doesn't require recurrence. And then also you could have a module that kind of is the slower recurrent one that would show maybe different effects of priming than the fast one, and you could compare those to the biology and the behavioral experiments.
All right, we have one question in the chat. Could you elaborate on the cognitive implausibility of the transformer architecture? If the stimulus is static, we can allocate attention to any part of the image without necessarily keeping information in memory. Do you think a combination of transformers and RNNs would be better?
Yeah, so in terms of the transformers, I mean, they have been demonstrated to be good at what people want to use them for, which is a lot of different tasks, including visual processing and translation and other things. So, as I said, I think part of that is because they don't have the type of recurrence that these other sequence models had. And we know just when you're training with backpropagation and stuff like that, recurrence makes things harder to train. And so if you can get a more simplified feed-forward network, you're going to probably do better, even if you have the same amount of data and all of that. So I think that's the fact that they don't have a recurrent part to them is kind of probably important for why they work well. So I wouldn't advocate for, you know, combining them with RNNs from a machine learning perspective. I think, you know, given the constraints of how we train networks now, they're kind of pushing in the right direction for getting good performance. But it is the case that it's harder to compare them to biology because of the lack of recurrence. And so really thinking about what they relate to in the brain is a little odd because a lot of, especially the type of attention I was talking about, this kind of top-down attention where you cue people and, like, you know, they have time to decide to deploy attention to something. A lot of that is just built into that is the notion of some kind of recurrence. And so in a way, the transformers look a little bit more like priming effects or something. They kind of look like, oh, you are reflexively processing this information in light of surrounding information, and it just all happens in this one feed forward go, which, yeah, it's just harder to actually compare to biological attention. It's just a step away from the way we think about biological attention, again, because of these machine learning reasons to do it a certain way. And there's no requirement that people in machine learning have to care about, you know, how to relate their models back to the brain or anything like that. But because they chose to call this attention. There's a lot of assumptions that this does have a strong tie to the mechanisms that the brain uses. And I just think that it's harder to do that mapping in a non-recurrent model where you're not kind of having a clear attention module that's weighting the sensory representations a certain way at different points in time and all of that.
All righty. Any other questions, either on the chat or here, I guess. Calling once, calling twice. I would say that's it for the questions. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay, for being with us today and giving your interesting talk about attention. And I would also like to thank the attendees who also asked their questions. And yep, I would say that's the end of the event.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much.